This occurred several months back. I've been driving for Lyft for a few years now, and I typically prefer late-night shifts. The roads have become more serene, and the advice offered is more insightful. Yet there is a compromise to consider. Occasionally, a narrative lingers in your mind, and not for pleasant reasons. I had always considered myself to be cautious. I've encountered my fair share of peculiar passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever come close to the strangeness of what I'm about to share with you. At that moment, I lacked a dash cam, and that night ultimately prompted me to get one. It began quite ordinarily, just me and the peculiar noises my car would sporadically emit. I have this worn-out 2005 Volvo, but it's incredibly dependable. The streets were utterly deserted, which, as I mentioned before, was to my liking. After 2 p.m., a request came in from a nearby convenience store. It appeared innocuous at the outset, yet inexplicably, an unsettling sensation began to stir within me. Have you ever experienced that sensation where everything feels slightly askew, yet you can't quite put your finger on a reason? That's precisely what struck me as I drove up. Before I even laid eyes on the guy, I had already unraveled the reason behind that gut feeling. The convenience store I approached was closed. Every light was extinguished, and the parking lot stood completely devoid of vehicles. As I drew nearer, I caught sight of him. I took my time driving, wanting to catch a good glimpse of him. He was pacing outside the store, clad in a worn hoodie that seemed to have evaded the washing machine for ages. I'm serious about that. A hole was present in the sleeve. His movements were erratic, as if he couldn't find his footing, and he frequently cast anxious glances over his shoulder, as though he believed someone was pursuing him. If I were to speculate, he seemed to be under the influence of something. I likely should have simply canceled the ride and driven off. I even hovered my finger over the cancel button, yet for some reason, I didn't press it. I opened the doors, and he slipped into the back seat in silence. I felt a wave of regret wash over me the instant I lifted my foot from the brake. While many individuals may find themselves lost in their phones or gazing out the window, he stands apart. He simply remained there, fixated on me through the rearview mirror, his gaze unwavering, unblinking, never diverting, just locked onto me. I made an effort to look away, yet I found myself glancing at him a few times despite my intentions. He appeared somewhat furious, which was rather disconcerting. I attempted to disregard him and switched on the radio to shatter the stillness. I can't recall which station I selected, but as soon as the music began to play, he abruptly told me to turn it off. His voice carried a deep, slightly raspy quality, immediately revealing his status as a smoker. That really took me by surprise, and I instinctively yanked the steering wheel just a tad. I fought against the temptation to glance at. He looked at himself in the mirror and followed his own advice, gripping the wheel a bit tighter. I remained silent, and we traveled in quietude for some time. I imagined he might simply remain there in silence until we reached his destination. That's what I was wishing for, at the very least. Yet he began to speak. I recall the conversation as if it happened just yesterday. He inquired whether I had ever. I got involved with someone I shouldn't have. That question struck me with the force of a brick. I released an uncomfortable chuckle and replied, "Well, I certainly hope not." I aimed to maintain a cheerful atmosphere, yet he remained unresponsive. He simply reclined and whispered something under his breath that escaped my ears. Then he began. He was rambling on about his past as an Uber driver, explaining how he decided to quit after some punk stole a few things from his car. He was slurring his words somewhat, making it difficult for me to catch everything he said, but I grasped the essence of the narrative for the most part. I glanced in the mirror a couple of times as he recounted the story, and I noticed he was smiling throughout, which was quite disconcerting. A typical individual wouldn't smile while conversing regarding something of that nature. He wrapped up his tale with the observation, "It's amusing how much faith you place in someone sitting directly behind you." That remark was the turning point for me. I began to perceive him as more of a danger than merely an unpredictable individual struggling with substance dependence. Regrettably, there was little I could do regarding the situation. I sensed my heartbeat quicken. I focused on the road ahead, yet my thoughts were in a whirlwind. I took a quick look at. The GPS directed us toward the destination, treating it as if it were a vital lifeline, yet the man continued to chatter endlessly, oblivious to the need for silence. He continued to ramble on about various topics, some of which were intriguing while others were simply nonsensical. I truly found it difficult to maintain pace. Eventually, he began to offer apologies to someone, though I doubt it was directed at me. He started to suggest that he had recently committed a terrible act and that he was a flawed individual. He kept saying, "I didn't mean it," over and over, followed by a few desperate, "I'm sorries." I chose not to reply, concerned that a response might provoke him into action. I had no idea what he had done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't going to discover it. We were just a few minutes from his stop. He suddenly broke free from his muttering haze and shouted at me that I had missed the turn. I didn't overlook it. The GPS clearly indicated we were on course, yet I hit the brakes nonetheless, primarily out of apprehension. He insisted that I pull over, so that's precisely what I did. At that moment, my hands trembled uncontrollably. I simply wished for the torment to come to an end. Just as I put the car in park, headlights suddenly emerged behind us. A police vehicle was present. I offered a quiet prayer and observed as it glided down the road, its beam of light momentarily illuminating my vehicle. The man in my back seat slumped down as if he were attempting to remain unseen. I shifted my gaze and noticed him sprawled almost completely flat on my back seat, his eyes shut tight. I quickly turned my head back before he noticed me, attempting to maintain a steady breath. He remained in that position for an exceedingly awkward duration. I contemplated asking him to leave, but ultimately chose not to. In the end, he raised his gaze and informed me that I had been fortunate. Before I could even react, he swung open my car door and vanished into thin air. I found myself ending my shift early after that. I felt unsettled and lost the desire to drive around any longer. A few weeks later, I stumbled upon something on my phone that revealed just how perilous the situation I had found myself in truly was. A recent news article reported that a convenience store experienced. I was robbed on the night I picked up that passenger. It was just 2 blocks from the spot where I had picked that guy up. It fills me with disgust to realize I was mere inches away from a perilous criminal who could have. He could have harmed me if he had chosen to. I feel a bit apprehensive about reaching out to the authorities regarding this matter. I prefer to steer clear of law enforcement for a variety of personal reasons that I won't delve into. I'm uncertain whether my report would be of any assistance. Regardless, I exercise greater caution regarding whom I allowed my car inside. I once resided in the city. The city life is truly what I have always imagined for myself. I'm not going to delve into it, but following a profoundly distressing experience, I found myself unable to tolerate even the faintest sounds. I started to despise noise overall. My psychiatrist informed me that I had developed a rare case of phonophobia, similar to that pins and needles sensation you experience when your foot falls asleep. It's somewhat similar to that, but within my heart, ever present. It felt as though my body was preparing for an event that never arrived. Each car horn and the sound of a slamming door struck me like a sudden shock to my senses. I just couldn't continue on in that way. Approximately 3 years back, I stumbled upon a cabin hidden deep within the Pacific Northwest. I prefer not to disclose the exact location for reasons that will soon become clear, but I will mention that it was situated somewhere in Oregon. It appeared flawless. Scarcely any neighbors, minimal traffic, hardly any cell service. Assistance. What truly captivated me about it, however, was the absence of noise. It was only me and the tranquility of silence. After months of uncertainty, a glimmer of safety began to emerge for the first time. The cabin was compact, yet inviting. To be fair, it delivered precisely what the listing had promised. It was evident that this structure was designed for durability, featuring robust wooden beams and a solid stone fireplace. The moment I stepped inside, the air was filled with the scent of pine and aged books. There's a certain earthy aroma that feels almost like a warm embrace. Imagine a cozy retreat reminiscent of those rustic cabin-style bed and breakfasts, especially for those who have experienced the thrill of skiing. The closest neighbor resided roughly a 10-minute stroll along a slender dirt path. I didn't encounter her immediately, however. In those initial days, I immersed myself in the stillness. I would rise to the melody of birds rather than the blare of sirens, and at night, the only sound that graced my ears was the gentle whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. It felt as if the entire universe had hit the pause button, and I was left in a moment of stillness. At last, inhale once more. I completed all my tasks from my laptop, so there truly was no necessity for me to engage with the outside world beyond that. A week after I settled in, I heard a knock at the door. The cabin clearly lacked a doorbell, so those knocked for something I would need to acclimate to. I opened the door, anticipating my neighbor's presence, and there they were. She was a woman of a certain age, carrying a basket filled with preserves, as if she had just walked out of a heartwarming film. She introduced herself as Michelle, mentioning that she lived about 10 minutes down the trail. It didn't seem far at first, but considering the density of the woods, it took on a different perspective. It's easy to lose your way in there while searching for firewood. She was in her late 60s, with strangely long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She wasn't impolite, precisely, more like straightforward. She greeted me in the woods, extending the basket toward me as if she anticipated my taking it. I didn't really have many options. She was almost forcing it upon me. It may come across as welcoming, yet her energy felt somewhat strange, if that resonates at all. I seized it on a whim, yet I must confess I had never experienced such treatment from a neighbor before. It wasn't anything wild, but it was definitely outside my usual experience. I expressed my gratitude as I accepted the basket, and she regarded me with an expectation that I would speak. Something different. I truly found myself a loss for words. So I simply offered a smile. Her gaze lingered on me in an uncomfortable way, reinforcing my belief that this woman wasn't accustomed to engaging with many others. At last, she found her voice. She said, and these were her exact words, which I'll never forget, "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." It wasn't a remark one would typically expect from an ordinary individual directed at another. It felt as though she was reading from a manual. It truly felt more like a caution than guidance. I nodded, smiled, and made my way back inside. Once the door was closed, I remained in silence, anticipating the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. She lingered for a good 45 seconds, which was likely the oddest aspect of the entire encounter. Even with the unusual atmosphere, I found her kindness to be quite admirable. She appeared withdrawn, yet not unapproachable. A person who would lend a hand if you reached out, yet wouldn't intrude or push for details. I reassured myself that it was comforting to know someone was nearby, even if I had no intention of actually meeting her. I didn't even take the time to glance in the basket. I simply placed it in the living room, and then it slipped my mind. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, a rare occurrence for Oregon, though not entirely unheard of. I lit a few candles and nestled into the couch with a book, attempting to overlook the flickering power that interrupted the stillness every few minutes. While some may perceive that level of isolation as frightening, I found it to be quite enjoyable. For some reason, my mind remained calm amidst the natural symphony of the thunderstorm. It was precisely that particular storm that brought me to that realization. I absorbed every sound from outside, and it was, if I may say, quite calming. However, that serene sensation was fleeting. A few hours into the storm, a sudden knock at the door startled me, nearly making me leap out of my skin. I assert a knock, though it was truly more akin to a banging. The noise was overwhelming, clearly artificial, as if the source was oblivious to the downpour outside. My heart raced, and I felt that dreadful, tingling sensation in my chest. After a moment of uncertainty, I took hold of a flashlight and rose to investigate who was there. I peered through the small glass window beside the door. There she was, Michelle, drenched completely and gripping a flashlight tightly. I opened the door, and she began speaking before I even had a chance to greet her. She suddenly exclaimed that she had spotted someone by my woodpile and that it was something I needed to be aware of. I found myself in a state of utter bewilderment, yet the gravity of her words overshadowed everything else. I emerged onto the porch, directing my flashlight into the downpour, yet all I could discern were the silhouettes of trees. I inquired if she was certain, and she gave a nod. Her gaze flickered toward the woods, as if she anticipated someone stepping out at any moment. The entire experience was quite unsettling. I continued to scan my surroundings, yet there was little I could discern amidst the shadows and the tumult of the tempest. Before I could utter another word, she cautioned me to be careful and started to walk away, not pausing for a reply. I observed her retreating down the path toward her cabin, seemingly unbothered by the relentless downpour. I lingered in that spot until the beam of the flashlight faded from view, and then I retreated indoors. The moment I closed the door, it struck me that her narrative was full of gaps. How could she? Have I spotted someone by my woodpile if her house is just 10 minutes away? She must have been on my property to start with. What on earth was she doing rummaging through my cabin in the middle of a thunderstorm? Was she being untruthful? It fell off to me. But heading over to her place in the midst of a thunderstorm was the absolute last thing I would consider doing. Nevertheless, I needed to take action. I secured the cabin as best as I could and settled into my room, attentive to the sound around me. The storm gradually began to subside, yet an unsettling feeling lingered within me. After a few more hours went by without any issues, I concluded that it was likely safe to drift off to sleep. I can't recall the exact hour, but it was sometime after midnight when I stirred awake to the sharp crack of a branch breaking just beyond my bedroom window. I'm quite sensitive to sounds while I sleep, so I was absolutely certain it was a branch breaking and not anything else. I stood still for a few tense seconds, listening intently. Slowly, I approached the window, secretly wishing that nothing would be there to greet me. Initially, I overlooked her presence, but soon enough, I noticed her. Michelle. She stood at the edge of the woods, her body turned slightly away from my house. It was unmistakably her. Her hair flowed long and unruly. I struggled to discern more, but with only the moonlight to aid my vision, it proved futile. I noticed her starting to pivot, so I quickly crouched down below the window to avoid being seen gazing at her. I remained huddled there for what seemed like an eternity, and at last, I gathered the bravery to glance once more. She had vanished. I truly had no idea what to do. I hadn't precisely categorized her as a threat, merely eccentric, yet at that moment, doubts began to creep in. It was utterly perplexing. Why would she attempt to warn me beforehand if she was the one snooping around? I was awake for hours on end. I was quite determined to stay awake until the break of dawn. Several hours went by, and fatigue began to set in. Just as I started to lower my defenses, a knock echoed at the door. It was different from the earlier banging. It was surprisingly serene. Nevertheless, I had no intention of rising under any circumstances. The pins and the needles began to stir once more as I silently approached the door. I cast a subtle glance through the pane and was struck motionless by dread. It was not Michelle. A robust, bald man with a dense beard stood before me. I struggled against every fiber of my being to keep from crying out in terror. The situation quickly escalated from a 6 to a 10. With utmost stealth, I slipped into my bathroom, secured the door, and dialed the police. While I was on the phone with them, a loud banging erupted at the front door, as if someone was relentlessly battering it with a heavy object. The operator assured me that assistance was on its way and advised me to stay on the line. I sat there, gripped by a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before. At last, the front door yielded, and I heard it slam open. I truly believed my life was at stake. That individual, whoever he may be, began to wreak havoc in my cabin. That's how it appeared, at the very least. The only sounds that reached my ears were the shattering of glass and the cracking of wood. I remained utterly silent. Fortunately, that man didn't appear to search for me, as I never heard his footsteps depart from the living room. Space. At last, the thunderous noise ceased, leaving me enveloped in utter silence once more. I had been battling a panic attack the entire time. To my surprise, the police arrived quite promptly, but it wasn't soon enough to apprehend that guy in the act. He had been absent for quite some time. I begged the officers for assistance, but they were utterly ineffective. They conducted a rather inadequate search of the surrounding property, but that was the extent of their efforts. They wouldn't even. They concurred to explore the woods, noting that the underbrush was too thick and that the chances of locating him there were slim. I pleaded with them to join me at Michelle's house, and they finally agreed. Upon arriving at her property, I was utterly astonished. The whole cabin lay deserted. The authorities verified this and stated that no one had resided there for decades. I informed them that they needed to investigate for squatters, yet they insisted there was no justification for doing so. Please proceed with that. They attempted to convince me that there were no obvious indications of habitation, suggesting it would be a futile endeavor. I nearly lost my mind when I heard them say that. I attempted to present my case, but they essentially conveyed that residing in the woods was a risk I had chosen to embrace, and it was not their concern. They departed after that, which drove me to frustration. I clearly relocated from that cabin, though not before enjoying one last night there. It was dreadful, yet I managed to get through unscathed. Life has been pleasant for me since that time, yet I find myself frequently reflecting on this experience. A few of my friends who are quite superstitious. I have come to the conclusion that Michelle might have been a spirit, one that sought to protect me. It seems she was merely trying to keep an eye on my property for some unknown reason. I don't believe in the paranormal, so I think it's much more plausible that two individuals, her and that. A man had taken up residence in that deserted cabin. I still can't grasp why they chose to focus on me or why Michelle would take the time to alert me if she intended to break in my abode. I suppose I may never find out. My name is Luke. Catherine and I crossed paths 3 years ago when we were both freshmen in college. We proceed to Stanford, a place I have dreamed of attending since I was around 8 years old. Neither of us hails from California. Quite distant from it, really. We both hail from Ohio. She hails from Cincinnati, while I reside just outside Columbus. I believe that's a significant reason for our mutual attraction. I believe individuals from comparable regions are inherently attracted to one another for various reasons. Stanford isn't a massive institution, yet a significant portion of the student population hails from California, which certainly sets us apart as Midwesterners. One of the customs we've established is the way we divide Christmas between our families. Catherine is well liked by my relatives, so her presence is consistently valued and embraced, almost anticipated at this stage. Given that her house is only a 2-hour drive from mine, we made the decision early on to spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrates that night, and then drive through the night to her place for Christmas Day. Before I encountered her, I was unaware that the majority of families observe Christmas on the actual day rather than the eve prior. Strangely, my most cherished moment of the holiday isn't Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. It's that late-night drive. It has evolved into a cherished tradition, something we eagerly anticipate each year. The initial experience we shared continues to be one of my most cherished memories with her. The fastest way from my place to hers, given my location, doesn't involve a major highway. The majority of the journey unfolds along serene backroads, flanked by fields, trees, and the rare sight of a distant farmhouse. It tends to be quite late at night when we engage in this, and coupled with the isolated path, we seldom come across any other vehicles. It seems as though the world is in a deep slumber, leaving us with everything at our fingertips. It might sound amusing, but we always crank up Juice WRLD during our drives. His music has captivated us both since the moment we crossed paths. I'm aware that his music might come off as a bit cringy, yet there's something truly special about singing the lyrics together. It feels as though we are perfectly aligned. This past Christmas Eve began just like any other. Following a delightful evening spent with my beloved extended family, we loaded up my car around midnight and set off on our journey. The snow drifted gently from the sky, blanketing the deserted roads in a serene hush, just as one would anticipate. With the music blaring and the heat turned up, everything felt just right. Everything shifted in a heartbeat. However, what I am about to recount is still one of the most disquieting experiences I have ever faced. Perhaps the most disconcerting aspect. I was cruising down the road when the melody was suddenly cut short by the sound of my phone ringing. I looked down, slightly annoyed that I was receiving a call at this hour. It was a mysterious figure. I dismissed it without a second thought. Likely a fraudulent call. Those elements remain unchanged in today's world. Catherine cracked a joke about the dedication of those call center folks who are making calls on Christmas. I chuckled in accord, and that settled it. However, just a few minutes later, my phone rang again. I glanced down once more and noticed it was yet another unfamiliar number, likely the same as previously. I sighed, feeling a wave of irritation wash over me, but ultimately decided to let it go to voicemail. Catherine shot me a look, her eyebrow arching in silent inquiry, yet her lips remained sealed. I angled my phone in her direction to reveal the unknown number, and she responded with a puzzled expression, saying, "That's so weird." I chose not to reply, merely shrugging my shoulders in response. The music eventually resumed, and I attempted to distract myself from the incessant phone calls. However, just 2 minutes later, my phone rang once more. I was furious at that moment, muttering curses as I clumsily searched for my phone. I grabbed it from the console and swiped forcefully across the screen, prepared to tell whoever was to back off for bombarding my phone with spam. I noticed that I had startled Catherine, as her body tensed with my sudden movements. Looking back, I might have reacted too strongly, but I was tired of the constant harassment. I essentially shouted hello into the phone with as piercing a tone as I could manage. I anticipated the scam script to unfold, yet I was greeted only by silence. I cranked up the volume in my car and instantly noticed a subtle static emanating from the other end of the line. I was just about to end the call when a man's voice interrupted me. The voice was unfamiliar, belonging to no one I recognized. I was completely taken by surprise. I almost veered off the road. I was rendered speechless. My entire body began to tingle with an itch, a familiar sensation that accompanies my nerves. Before I had a chance to reply, the man pressed on. He began to share intimate details, my full name, my address, aspects of my life that should remain private, information that no outsider could possibly possess. Thoughts swirled in my head, each one vying for clarity. I felt an urge to pull over to the side of the road, yet I continued moving forward as if caught in a trance. I thought about raising my voice at him, but I realized that anger wasn't the most effective tool in a situation like this. After a brief, charged silence, I finally found my voice. I inquired of him what he desired, maintaining a calm tone, attempting to mask the apprehension that stirred within me. The voice hesitated, a chilling moment before unleashing the words that sent a shiver down my spine. He mentioned that his presence wasn't for me, but rather for Catherine. Listening to my girlfriend's name felt 100 times more frightening than hearing my own, and the look of horror on her face revealed that she was just as taken aback as I was. I exclaimed that I wasn't familiar with a Catherine, and that he must have dialed the wrong number. The man let out a laugh before responding. That was a bit overwhelming for me. I stopped on the shoulder of the road. I was left with no options. My hands trembled uncontrollably, gripped by fear. I was on the verge of speaking when Catherine, in one seamless motion, reached into my lap and ended the call. In an instant, I found myself shouting directly at her, insisting to understand why she had abruptly ended the call with someone who was making personal threats against us. She remained silent, merely gazing at me with her wide, fearful eyes. I made every effort to call the number back, once, twice, 3 times, yet it never connected. Catherine instructed me to maintain. I proceeded to drive, but not without first questioning her. She expressed her fear, mentioning that I couldn't fault her for ending the call, which seemed reasonable enough. I drove away quietly, yet I remained puzzled about why she would end the call. I do not, unsure if my emotions leaned toward anger or fear. A part of me anticipated that number to call back, but after roughly 10 minutes, I sensed that it was growing less probable. At one moment, I glanced at Catherine and noticed tears glistening in her eyes. She expressed her feelings of insecurity, and I could truly relate to that. A feeling in the depths of my stomach troubled me. However, Catherine and I had experienced. In our relationship, I've come to realize that trust was not always a simple matter. There had been small details, innocent deceptions, fragments of truth, instances when I noticed her not being entirely forthcoming. I was aware that my thoughts were bordering on paranoia. However, how could she have possibly been involved in this? The remainder of the journey unfolded in quietude. I refrained from playing the music once more, and silence enveloped us both. My thoughts were swirling with countless unresolved inquiries. Who on earth was that individual? How could he possibly know so much about me? Only my family was aware of our destination that night, and they would never share something like this. I was absolutely certain of it. I found myself at a loss for any other explanation. However, even as we finally arrived at Catherine's driveway, I still didn't feel much better. Nearly a month has passed since this occurred, and I have. Still waiting for my responses. None of our family members were accountable. We inquired with each of them. Catherine insists she's just as lost as I am, which makes me think the person on the other end of the phone call is equally perplexed. Harbored dark motives. You may believe I'm overreacting to what seems like a harmless prank, but I assure you, aside from our family, there are no individuals on this planet who were aware that Catherine and I would be on the road that night. I felt a constant tension ever since. Every time my phone rings, I find myself bracing for whatever news might come my way. I'm certain he will reach out to me again at some point. It's merely a question of time.